It's a pleasure to be here. And if anyone is on Zoom joining us, it's a pleasure to have you with us as well. I know none of you, and none of you know me. I know Philip Martin, I believe, helped connect us, and I've known Phil a long time. He and I used to room together a long time ago, but we won't talk about that. This is also my first time in Washington. I've come here from the Tampa area, so we basically gone today from one corner of the country to the other. And I'm here with my son Noah. My wife and I have 5 children, and I was able to take Noah with me this time. And so I'm thankful to have him have a father-son experience as well. And a lot of our introductory time before services was taken trying to figure out technical issues, but we got them solved. Ironically, one of the keys to this was not using my computer, but that's fine. We have the tools. I'll go ahead and get into it since I know we have a time pressure tonight. But archaeology, this is the way. How archaeology works with faith. And if you've seen the schedule, we're going to be addressing archaeology, different aspects, different topics along the way. And this is something I've been involved with for a number of years now. I have a master's degree in ancient classical history, but archaeology is not history. It's a different thing. And we don't really learn archaeology entirely by just reading about it. I read about it plenty before I actually started doing it. My first time doing archaeology was in the year 2009, so just over 12 years ago. And this was my first year. The photo, if you can see that, my father was with me. He's the one catching the bucket, and I am using the force to levitate in the air. Now, I had to get a Star Wars reference. My name is Luke, after all. And maybe some of you caught my slight reference at the title of the lesson. But the location is wonderful. It's an ancient city I'll talk more about over the next few lessons here and there. But the valley in the distance is where David killed Goliath. And talk about a place to dig, your first experience. And I was here 5 seasons, 5 years in a row at this dig, covering a city that was built around the time of David. And so that's the same time period as the battle in that valley, which is quite a thing. And that city turned out to be key because there's the time of David has been a big blank archaeologically, which raised questions for a long time. And then the past 13, 14 years, we've filled in a lot of that blank. And one of the keys to that is this site. We'll talk about that later. But archaeology, some people, why do we need archaeology? We just sang a song, faith is the victory. What's the definition of faith? We can go to Hebrews. Faith is the evidence of things not seen, the substance of things hoped for. We don't see it. And archaeology is what we actually find and see. Archaeology is not faith. Archaeology is what you actually dig up and touch and see with your senses. Faith is what we believe, having not seen and touched it. And so faith is the victory. And in a sense, though, even with archaeology, we still live by faith. We can find rocks and weapons and cities and so on, but can we see David fight Goliath? No. Can we see Jesus perform a miracle? Those things are still faith. No matter what we find, in the end, our faith is based on what we do not see and will not be able to see. But archaeology does help us already. And how is that? Archaeology, in fact, has probably already helped you and me. Let me ask a question. How long is a cubit? Does anyone know? Yeah, roughly distance from the elbow to the tip of the long finger, something like that. And there's actually maybe 3 different standards of cubit out there that we discovered. But how do we know it's like from the elbow to the tip of the finger? Archaeology taught us that. So even if we know nothing about archaeology and think we don't need it, in one sense, maybe we don't. But in the same way, things we understand have already been shaped by things from archaeology. We found standards, like standard measure. This is a cubit. And so that's how we know. We find stones all cut to the very same length, which that's the standard of measurement back then. So we already know that. How much was a denarius? Jesus spoke of a denarius once in a while. How much was that? How do we understand that amount? Typical day's wage for a worker. How do we know that? Archaeology taught us that. And so even in small ways like that, archaeology has already shaped the way we read the Bible, and the way we understand things from the Bible. When Jesus talks about a denarius, or we know the ark was X number of cubits long, we have a concept of what that means, thanks to archaeology. So it has already made a difference. How long ago did David live? If we round it to the nearest century, does anyone know? That'd be something we just have floating around. But if you say 3,000 years ago, about 1000 BC, you'd be right. How do we know it's 1,000 years ago? Archaeology has helped us find key pieces that put things together to get that date. So David's about 3,000 years ago, about 1,000 years before Christ. Have you ever heard about the needle's eye when Jesus talks about it's easier for a camel to go to the eye of the needle than for a rich man to go to heaven? Have you ever heard what the eye of the needle is supposed to be? A little side opening at a city gate that a camel can squeeze through. I don't know, maybe have you heard that before? Or is this your first time? Okay, a couple of you are nodding. That's a myth. That's not true. When Jesus is talking about the eye of the needle, he's talking about the eye of the needle who sowed it. And actually, that makes his point more powerful. A rich man, someone who trusts in his riches, there's no way he's going to heaven because his faith is in his wealth. And so that's the point he's trying to make. He's not saying if you trust in your riches, you still can if you really just kind of work it through there. That's not his point. We've dug up tons of city gates, and they don't have this needle's eye thing. That's a myth, an urban legend. Someone decades or a century or more ago started. It's one of those things that people keep repeating, but it's not actually true. And archaeology has shown us that. And so we've heard that before. Learning the truth that needle's eye is small entrance trying to squeeze a camel through. No such thing. And archaeology has demonstrated that. And it actually helps reinforce and renew Jesus' points there. We understand it the way the original audience understood it. Archaeology helps with that. I'm going, why am I talking about archaeology? Anyone can read about it. I've actually been on some digs. Here's my first one in 2009. I was sifting looking for small things. And there's my first full day, my second full day on a dig. And I'm sitting there, sunrise, looking at my new hat, my new pants, and my new boots, and all happy to be there. But I'm standing, I just look kind of awkward when I'm standing there. And that would be very appropriate because I didn't know what I was doing yet. I was excited. And there, my first job was to clear off this staircase in an ancient building. And there, after I finished, trophy, I did it. I cleared the dirt out and I covered the steps. And if I still, clean clothes, that brimming, I'm standing up straight. I'm happy to be here. But a couple of weeks of hard work and sweat knocked it out. There I am, my third week, my first year, trying to look cool, standing in the city gate. But I don't know if you can tell my pants. Yeah, my pants are dirty now. My boots are all scuffed up. And I finally know something of what I'm doing. But that was my first year. And the first year was kind of out of the blue. Hey, you want to go join a dig? I'm like, wow, let me check with my wife. She said, yes, okay, I'll try it once. And I've been back 10 times. So it just kind of got in my blood. Here are photos from other seasons I participated in, all of them in Israel, all of them biblical sites. So we don't always know the name of the site in the Bible. Some sites aren't mentioned in the Bible, like every single town doesn't make its way in the Bible. But they're from biblical periods and from a specific the time of David, primarily. Mostly I've dug around the time of David, mostly. Though some from the time of the Judges as well, and once from the time of Josiah, later in the kingdom years. But I've put a lot of time in over there, so I've gained a lot of experience. It's exciting stuff, and if it wasn't, I wouldn't keep going. And how many of us like an Indiana Jones movie? Now, a good Indiana Jones movie, he's a terrible archaeologist. So, he has a hat, but his excavation tools are a revolver and a whip. We don't use those, in case people was wondering. He destroys an entire building to get one piece of gold out. That's terrible. You find booby traps hundreds of years old that still work. That's incredible. Don't just set them off and survive and grab the thing and have the stone knock everything down. You got what counted, what mattered, right? Just the one thing. That's not the way archaeology works. He's fun to watch, but Indiana Jones is a horrible archaeologist. He's a treasure hunter. But I like the movies as much as anybody. Now, how does it really work? Just to get a very brief sense of it. You start off, once you've decided where you're going to dig, and which spots you're going to dig in. That's a whole process that you go to school for to learn how to do. But you pick an area, you put these big shade nets up. You dig in the shade. And it makes a difference because it doesn't just help you keep your energy up, keep the sun from beating you down as badly. But later in the day, you want to be attentive. If you notice, if you see something small, you don't want to be so worn down by the sun that you miss it. That used to happen probably a lot. But you mark off an area with sandbags. Typically, the standard size is 5 meters by 5 meters, like a square. That's the current way to do it. Sometimes, depending on the ground, you may make it a little smaller or whatever. But you mark it off and take off the topsoil, and then you take a hoe and you scrape. And you scrape into buckets and you take out the dirt and you look for things that aren't natural, like stones in a line, or straight lines, or pottery, or weapons, or this and that. If dirt's really, really packed down, you have a dirt floor. That's a floor level. And so a dwelling or something maybe. But you go through, it's a slow process, but eventually you can get really low over time. You dig a certain amount each week and it's steady. It's like draining a bathtub very slowly. The whole thing evenly across. You find something, you know they're in the same period. If you find something on this side, find something else about 6 inches below it, level-wise, those could be 300 years apart from each other. So you go evenly, you don't just dig a hole, you go evenly, and so you're always at the same time period, relative to what you find. Everything's together. Now here's one square I dug a few years ago. After we leveled it off, that's what we had. It was on a slope, so we leveled it off, and you see that big stone up there. Maybe that's something. It turned out not to be, but look in the top right. Oh, see that flat stone that eventually turned up? That's flat, so maybe it's something, man-made. So we kept going, and here's we dig some more, we find some more stones, and see there's a straight line of stones appearing. Straight lines of stones don't appear naturally. There's an expression, find one stone, nothing. 2 stones together, coincidence. 3 stones in a row, that's a wall. 3 stones make a wall, that's the expression. So we found several stones, and so we have something. And so we know it's not just a random thing. Keep digging and you see a straight line, and begin to see a corner emerge. You look at the next square over for hours, and you see a wall coming in and joining, so you see some kind of structure. And so you see things emerge from the soil, and you're looking for evidence of design or man-made. And then you go another week later, and look what all you've covered. There's a circular mud brick feature there. There's some little stone thing on the floor, and there's more of that thing you found there. So you go through, we found pottery, we found plaster that was used to coat the walls, we found animal bones, we found a storage pit, you find all these things. But you have the architecture also. Then after you do all that, see how neat that is? And it started off way up there, it started off like that. But over 2 weeks, we got to this. 2 weeks of work, but look what we found. It turned out to be a Canaanite temple from the time of the Judges. And the whole thing got burned in different parts of the building, different squares. The soil was discolored from the heat of the flames, and it was incredible. And we were able to determine from study and analysis that likely the roof caught fire first, and it all collapsed into a room full of olive oil, which is combustible. And the whole thing, and the heat, the intensity, it burned the whole thing up. But maybe a violent attack. We don't know who did it. But the whole city was destroyed, so it was probably an invasion or attack of some kind. Anyway, but after you dig it up, then comes the real work. You have to analyze it and research it. That can take a long time. You go to the library, you compare with other archaeologists who have found things. Did they find something similar? Compare them. Does it mean something? And it takes a long. And you study things. Here, this is a few years ago, 3 years ago. And the woman in the front of the purple shirt is a Christian from Pennsylvania, who was part of the group that went with me that year. They're cleaning animal bones that we found in the field. You clean them up with a toothbrush, and you study what kinds of animals they were, where the bones were. Was it burial? Was it trash? Were they clean animals, unclean animals, according to the law of Moses? Things like that. Were they sacrificed? Were they just someone's dinner? You can tell by looking for different pieces of evidence. And so you you study other things, and then after you're done, you publish what you found, where you found it, how you found it. You publish everything. You put it out there so people can see what you found, and you tell them what you think it means, and let them check and see if your logic is sound. And that's an important part. A lot of people don't get to this point before they form their conclusions. And sometimes when you put it out there, people point out other perspectives or other things that the excavator missed. And it's a part of the process. You publish and let people fact check it. and check your reason. And it's valuable. This is a Philistine heart. And you get a little pillar, and maybe that had religious significance. These stones in front were for offerings of some kind. And you find the style of Philistine cities. We found it on the border of Judah, in the city of Judah. Are there Philistines living in Judah? Someone's building a Philistine hearth in their house. Maybe. The Bible indicates there are a number of Philistines who defected to join David. And they were his most loyal followers, as it turned out. And so maybe this is one of those families. You know, there's a juglet, maybe held perfume or something at one time. Here's the city gate, the one I was photographing earlier, looking out. It's a complete city gate. You can see a line of stones just right as center going out the gate. That's an underground drainage system, sewer, to have rainwater and trash. They had some urban planning back then. 3,000 years ago in Judah. That's impressive. And here's some guys, a couple Christians who were with me. They found that. He found a grinding stone. A grinding stone was how women turned grain into flour. You sit there, put your grain on the bottom stone, to the top one, just rub it and grind it up into flour. Probably get little bits of stone in with the flour. And so over time, you probably damage your teeth eating bread as little tiny bits of stone in there. But that's the way they did it. Here is both grinding stones. The lower one and the upper one, if you grind the wheat or barley or whatever between them to make flour. You find a lot of those, that's someone's kitchen. Here's a woman who actually worships with me. She's a nurse and went with me 1 year. That's a smaller grinding stone and it fit her hand perfectly. Designed for a woman's hand. Stone, but it fit perfectly. And she had to just marble it. Like the thumbs, like a little pressure for your thumb to fit in, it fit her hand perfectly. Someone's grinding stone. Here's a chalice. You know, some warrior wants to toast their success. They drank from this. So the time of David. Maybe one of David's men. Here's my son Caleb 2 years ago, and about 5 inches ago in height. He went with me, and there's one of the archaeologists teaching him how to excavate pottery. And he actually found some. He had a wonderful time, wants to go back. There's my oldest daughter back 4 years ago. She found a sling stone. That's a military-grade sling stone. That's what it looks like a stone tennis ball. And we find lots. There's one I found about 2 years ago, or someone else found it. That's my hand holding it, but they're very common, actually. It's like an ancient sniper. Imagine that hitting your body at 70 miles an hour. You know, that's what slingers do, and it gives a different picture. The Bible talks about a sling. Now we see it's like a sniper with a really massive caliber round. That's a slinger. Okay, here's a set black in the side there. That's ash. The city burned, a destruction layer, and it bursts out. Thick it is. And here's something I excavated about 10 years ago. That's 10 years. Someone's pantry, maybe see the soil's blackened, these big pots, they were full of seeds. And it turned out it was someone's, there were 3 jars, one had lentils, one had wheat, and one had peas. Someone's food pantry right there. And there's the name of the city, it's a biblical city, and it had been burned and preserved for 3,200 years. And that's one of the neatest things I got to find. That's someone's food in their kitchen. So here, a preacher from Kentucky worked with me one time, and he found some gold. You run a little chain through that, it's a pendant to go around your neck. And and horns represent strength in the Bible. So someone's wearing a little pendant with a symbol for horns. Pagan item, the altar of the Tabernacle had horns on it too. And so maybe it was, who knows, but it maybe had some religious significance for the person who wore it. Anyway, neat things. How can we tell how old something is? You know, this is 3,000 years old. This is 2,000 years old. The simplest way is usually pottery. Pottery is everywhere over in the Bible land. You find pottery everywhere. Sometimes intact, usually damaged. But when you find pottery, you wash it later after you get home and take the afternoon off to snooze and take a nap or do Facebook or whatever. You go out and wash your pottery and clean it off, and you see what you have. And see that that's a Canaanite design. And pottery is like fashion. It changes with time. People who study pottery can take about 10 seconds looking at a piece or a piece like this, and they can give you a date within a century or two, usually, a couple hundred years, more or less, which isn't bad for 10 seconds to study. It's like if I mentioned bell bottoms and long collars, what decade of clothing are we thinking of? The 70s, right? Parachute pants, the 80s. This design, late Bronze Canaanite, 1200 to 1300 BC-ish. Okay, that's kind of how it works. Pottery changes with style over the years. 2 years ago, here's a lamp, and lamps change with style too. This one, it had been used and burned. The fire was on the right side, see the blackened section. And it was intact, but not usually intact. Okay, give me an approximate date for these artifacts. Let's practice dating some pottery or this. Give me a decade for this car. Anyone? 2010? Okay, not bad. It's 2008. So you're within 2 years. That's pretty good. How about this one? Give me a decade.
40s.
It's the 40s. 1940, World War II Jeep. Built, this one was like, I think they were usually built in the early 40s. How about this one? What's the decade? 1920, 1910, it's 1908. Model T4, 1908. So pretty close. But see, even if we're off a little bit, we're not that far off. How about last one? This one. I used to own one of these, so I know exactly what year it is. 60s. It's a 1967 Mustang. Yes. But see, even with that, we can get within a decade or two usually, pretty easily. That's how pottery works. You find pottery, you study it, you can tell the fashion, the style, decorations, thickness, and so on, and get within a couple centuries. So it's a quick way to date things. There's a danger though. Date that. Any ideas? We're excavating a room and we find that. What is it? It's a cannonball. So want to try to give me a century? A guesstimate? Okay, let's keep going. How about that?
1865.
1865. That's very specific. Why do you say that? What is that?
The Civil War hat.
A Civil War hat. More specific, which side? It's Confederate. A Confederate Civil War hat. So that cannonball, same room. Maybe the 1860s. Oh, here's a coin. Oh, coins are great because they give us information. What's the date of that coin? 1862. Is that what it says? Oh, that's consistent. So this room we're finding these things? When was this room probably built or used? 1860s. We found one more thing. It's a museum. Oops. Okay, see, what if we haven't found that museum sign? Oh, this literally dates to the 1860s. But it's a museum. If we read down, it was actually built in the 1930s. The building was. It's a museum. So the artifacts, in this case anyway, can throw us off if we don't find the sign that says museum. So archaeology is not a perfect science. What if we miss something that could change what we think we know? So if you're humble and careful with it. Like any tool, archaeology can be missing. Other ways we can date things, coins, when they use coins. We can count the layers. Normally, the further down we go, the older it is. So that helps. Sometimes written records of history mention a war or a battle or an eclipse or something that relates to something we find and it helps us date it in some way. Architecture, buildings have style also. And so the style of building can date it sometimes. And a radiocarbon dating, there's a plus or minus, but it's a tool that is useful sometimes. The further back we go, the less accurate it is. But if you have this voice and all these other voices together and cross them, it gets our dating more and more accurate. So there are other tools as well. There's a new one that the University of Israel came out with. Anything made of mud brick. Turns out they used animal manure in their mud brick. And you can date the manure, some process, to get an idea of how long ago it was deposited. And it'll help you date the building by the manure in the mud brick, which is not something we think of normally. So, wow. Okay. There are lots of ways to get dates, and using them all together, it helps us narrow things down. But in archaeology, we tend to look for big things. Now, those are the fun things, the Indiana Jones kind of things, right? For example, this inscription is not, the actual inscription is smaller than it appears on the screen, but see those white letters? That translates to the house of David. And that was written by a king from Syria about 150 years after David lived. So 150 years after David, the Syrians are writing down, yeah, David existed. That's tremendous. It's the first confirmed and so far the only 100% confirmed mention of David outside the Bible we have. There's another one, but it's not as certain, so we don't really count it the same way. That's big, a big person in the Bible mentioned by name by an enemy. And that's huge. And how about this? Back 16 years ago, archaeologists uncovered what they believe is David's palace that he built in Jerusalem. And we don't know 100%, but probably is where it comes out. It didn't have much pottery. Apparently, it was scraped clean. So for some reason, there wasn't much to find. It might have been built a little before David. We're not sure. But it might be David's palace. See how thick that wall is compared to the first. It's not just your typical home. But big things, David's palace, David's fame. And yet, in archaeology, it's the small things that tend to reveal more and to be more impressive. If we want to use archaeology to support the Bible, to support our faith, how do we do that? And one thing that's useful is to not just try to look for the big things, because they're not as many as you think. And some of them, in spite of how popular they are not as sure as sometimes they're presented. We found David's palace. Probably. But there's an element of doubt there, and we have to acknowledge it. Because people, Christians, believers, have been burned before by proclaiming, archaeology's found this, and using that, and then it turns out later on, that's not what we thought it was. Doesn't mean the story in the Bible is wrong or anything, but this doesn't relate to that like we were assuming it did. And it makes believers look bad, and they can work against us. So we need to be careful. But small things are more impressive. For example, the first time I worked over David and Goliath's battlefield for 5 years, we found all these weapons over the course of 7 years of work. And you see, arrowheads and daggers and an axe head. I was there with an axe head and stones. I found one of those on the far right, 3 little dagger blades. I found one of those. I forget which one. And then in the middle, the big things kind of curved, are swords made out of iron. Those swords, what's a typical sword look like at the time of David? Well, we found 3. They look something like that apparently. And we found others that are similar. But here's one neat thing about it. Those 3 swords were all found together in a room dedicated to religious practice. Not an armory, not a weapon storage, not someone's house and the family weapons are kept somewhere. They're found in a place where they're worshiping something. It might have been God. It might have been the God of Israel. We don't know. It's in a city inhabited by people from Judah. And where that guy is sitting is that part of the room that it's a very narrow looking room with the stones that line on the left side was actually built 700 years later on top of the old room. You just can't tell because it's all been dug up. But originally that bench he's sitting on was from the time of David, and the room was more open in front of him. But they found religious things in there. Everything in the room was religious practice. And yet we found 3 swords in there as well. And that seems like an odd thing. But then we notice this little story in the Bible from the same time period. In 1 Samuel chapter 21, David is officially on the run from Saul. He goes into a town called Nob, or Nob, I would pronounce it, and it's a priestly town. They live there. They don't know yet David is fleeing. And he goes there to the priest and says, hey, do you have any food? Do you have any weapons? Because I don't have anything. I have a mission to do. The priest gave David the holy bread from the bread of the presence, normally the tabernacle. Then David said to him also, do you have a spear or a sword? And the priest, look what he said. On the sword of Goliath, the Philistine who you struck down in the valley of Elah, it's here wrapped in the cloth behind the ephod. The ephod is part of the high priest's outfit. We have a high priest stuff in a priestly town, a religious room, a religious building. But there's a sword being stored in there too. It's not the same city where you found these 3, it's a different one, but it's a town from the very same time period. And David takes it. But why are they storing Goliath's sword with the high priest's stuff? And we don't know. It doesn't tell us. But it's interesting that we find in a nearby city, the very same time period, swords being stored in a religious room in a different place. That little detail pops up only then in the Bible, at one time, and yet in archaeology we find that same thing happening in the same time period, not too far away. Why? We don't know, but we find this practice mentioned in the Bible. We find it in archaeology. That's not a big thing, it's a small thing, and yet we see there's a connection. Even if we can't fully explain it, that's a very specific coincidence. And that, in some ways, to me, speaks more strongly. Does the Bible talk about real things, or is it just legend? It got that thing right. The only time we find weapons being stored in the religious room of the Bible is the same time we find it in archaeology. And how about this? I mentioned a religious room. Look at this story of Samuel when he's a boy. It's a famous story. The boy Samuel was in 1 Samuel 3. Eli, whose eyesight had begun to grow dim, he couldn't see. He was lying down in his own place. And Samuel, where's he lying down? In the temple where the ark is? Why is Samuel sleeping where the Ark of the Covenant is kept? Like in the same room, maybe just the other side of the curtain or something? That's what it looks like. Samuel's using the tabernacle, the temple, as a residence. Now, he's a boy. Eli apparently permits it. It doesn't judge it. It just states it's happened. Israel's a pretty sorry state spiritually at this point. Eli is a very effective high priest, so maybe it's not surprising. But that's what the Lord called Samuel, and Samuel thinks it's Eli and goes there, and it turns out to be the Lord for the first time using Samuel as a prophet. He was a boy. But look, he's lying down. He's using a religious place as a place to dwell, to lie down, to go to bed. It's like multi-use. And here's our first site again. We found those 3 swords, but we found 3 different religious rooms. In archaeology, they call them cultic. That means religious. For some reason, cultic sounds more highfalutin. I don't know. Cultic means religious in archaeology. They found 3 rooms. Not one building we dug up was a dedicated temple. Like this whole building is used to worship something or someone. We found houses. 3 different houses where one room was religious and the rest of it is just ordinary house stuff. That's odd, but it's the very same time period we see Samuel using the tabernacle with Eli's blessing. Maybe Eli's the one who instigated it as a residence / religious place. Again, these details, they're small, but they match. And that to me speaks more powerfully. The big things, they're fun and popular, but these small details perhaps carry more weight. We're trying to use archaeology to demonstrate the Bible does speak about historical reality. We can trust what it tells us about those past times. It's not, here's one of the religious rooms right here, fully excavated. See that standing stone? You worship that. It represents something. They often have an image of a god carved up. This one had no image. Someone may have been using that to worship the God of Israel, but there's no image. Don't make unto me the graven images. That could reflect that, even though they're still using a stone to represent God, perhaps. But in that same room, how do we know it's religious? There's a stone. But see that flat stone right there? It's an offering table. It's flat. We are offering on it and we're praying. And we also found this vessel used for libations, like we pour a liquid at one side, bless it, and pray over it, pour it out the other side, sanctified. And there's a little basin, which we find in the religious rooms, and we found an altar. So it's a religious room, but it's in a house. The other rooms don't have anything religious in them. They're normal houses. So isn't that interesting? And speaking of religious rooms and houses, let's also look at this from about the same time period. Samuel to David. The Philistines captured the Ark of the Covenant, but they sent it back after they had a bunch of plagues. When Israel got it back, they didn't take it back to the tabernacle. Apparently, the tabernacle had been burned by the Philistines. They brought it to someone's house, a guy named Abinadab in a town called Kiryat Jearim. I know it just flows off the tongue, doesn't it? But they brought it to someone's house, and it stayed there a long time. It says at least 20 years. It turns out it's more than that. But it stayed in someone's house, in a room in someone's house for decades or more, until the time of David. And David decides to move it to Jerusalem after he's king. They took it from that person's house. Uzzah touched it on the way up. Uzzah died. And so what did they do? They took it to someone else's house and left it there for 3 months. And so the ark is staying in people's houses for extended periods of time. In the very same time period, we find houses with a religious room, but not a religious building in town. Isn't that interesting? By the way, the house, Obed-Edom, the Gittite, Goliath was a Gittite. Gittite means someone from Gath. There's someone from Gath living in Judah, and he gets the ark in his house and he's blessed. There's a Philistine who came over with David, apparently. And he lives near Jerusalem, and the Ark of the Covenant of Israel goes to this Philistine's house, and God blesses him because he's apparently a faithful Philistine. Isn't that a foreshadowing of the gospel? The house of David and the gospel of the descendant of David. Isn't that something else? But the archaeology describes similar things happening in the same time period. The Bible talks about historical reality. And here's one from much later, during the Babylonian exile. In the city of Babylon, we found a set of clay tablets with cuneiform that is writing on them. They're receipts for food. Ooh, exciting stuff, right? Receipts for food. Except that 4 of these tablets mention a king of Judah who was living in Babylon in exile. His name is Jehoiakim or Jehoiachin, however you want to pronounce it. And he's the second to last king of Judah, descendant of David. He was carried off to Babylon in exile, the second time Nebuchadnezzar captured Jerusalem, of the 3 times he went there. And he lived in the palace, and it says in the Bible, in 2 Kings 25, that eventually Jehoiakim was released from prison, and he had his meals in the king of Babylon's presence, and a regular allowance of food was given to him each day for the rest of his life in Babylon. We found receipts for that. That little detail, we just read over it when we're reading 2 Kings. So we pay any attention to that. Except now we're finding receipts about this dated portion given. Wow, that carries weight. Does archaeology support the Bible? Yes. It's nice to see famous big things, but the small things, the big things tend to be remembered. You know, the Hittites, the Romans, people don't forget those names because they were big and famous and had huge impact. But people forget the small stuff unless you write it down to preserve it. And that carries a lot more impression, possibly, in using the archaeology with the Bible to support our faith. This is the city I spent 5 years helping dig up. We found those religious rooms, and it turns out it's a city of Judah on the border of the Philistines. It took several years to build. The Philistines couldn't stop them. What does it tell you about the power of the government of Judah? We can hold the Philistines off for several years while we build this city. Judah's strong in the time of the Philistines, of David and the Philistines, just like the Bible says. We can interpret things that way. But it's a small thing. And we know it's the time of Judah. One reason, several reasons. One of them is that we found thousands of animal bones and none of them were unclean. We found no pig bones. We find them in Philistine places, Canaanite places. We don't find any pig bones here. They're eating according to the law of Moses. A little thing like that reveals quite a bit. Here's a town called Bet-Shemesh. Archaeology won't identify it. It's a biblical city. But it's interesting because that's where Samson hung out. Because Samson, it says his dad was from Zorah. That's over there. Archaeology has identified that place. And the Spirit of the Lord began to stir Samson between Zorah and Eshtaol. Eshtaol is nearby. And so archaeology has identified these sites. This is Samson's stomping ground, and the geography fits. Now we see Samson's life as a boy. And speaking of that also, Samson went to Timnah, a city of the Philistines, saw a girl, went back and said, I want to marry her. And then Timnah's right down the valley. That's the Philistine side over there. This is the border. And the Philistines are right down there, just a short walk. And while he's walking to his parents, he encounters a lion and kills it with his bare hands down there near Timnah. But in the archaeology from Bet-Shemesh, a few years ago, someone dug up this little seal, and it doesn't say anything, but they interpreted it. It dates to the time just after Samson, maybe 100 years, 150 years at the most. And it has some large creature with a big tail, not a sheep or a goat, struggling with a man. And speculation was maybe this was someone remembering that story of their local hero Samson and the story of the lion. Can't prove it, but it's possible, isn't it? And so things like that give us connections and insights. We're about out of time, but we're just almost near the end of this too. It's also where the Philistines sent the ark back after they captured it. They had plagues, and they sent it back on a cart. And the Bible says it stopped in one of the fields by Bet-Shemesh, the field of Joshua of Bet-Shemesh. There's Bet-Shemesh, the fields out here. One of these fields is where the Ark of the Covenant stopped. And so we can see the Bible reflects the story. This description of the places is real and it fits. The Bible writers knew what they were talking about, and they knew the places involved and described them accurately. The stories and the places they fit together just fine, perfectly. Sometimes there may seem to be a contradiction. We'll talk more in detail about some of those later on in the series. But there's one thing to keep in mind: archaeology and faith. If we find something that seems possibly to contradict the Bible in some way, some people jump on that. The Bible, made up, can't trust it. Hold on. There are three possibilities to explain it. The first possibility is saying, maybe the Bible's wrong. Maybe stuff is made up, or stories were changed later on, and that's why we have the contradiction. Okay? But there's a second possibility. And we can see it illustrated in the search for the city of Ai, city Joshua fought against in the conquest of Jericho. A long time ago, the site was identified for the geography and descriptions we have in the text, a place that in Arabic was called Et Tel. And over 100 years ago, it was identified based on all these evidences. That's Ai. And yet, as they went and excavated there, they found evidence of a city, but it had been abandoned apparently for 1,000 years before Joshua got there. And so, is the Bible wrong? This is Ai, but the story is obviously, it couldn't take place with the city because the city was already gone for hundreds or 1,000 years. The timeline doesn't match, so the Bible obviously is wrong. No? There's no possibility. What if the archaeology is wrong? A few years ago, someone did a survey and dug at a site across over there, and they found everything fits for that. The geography, the descriptions fit, and that was a small town inhabited during the time of Joshua. And it also fits all the evidence and the descriptions for Ai. Is the Bible wrong, or is it possible that archaeologists got it wrong initially and didn't realize it? Sometimes the archaeology is wrong. People dig in the wrong place, and then that may explain the problem. Or maybe the thing we're looking for didn't survive, and maybe we're misinterpreting it, like that Civil War room that was actually built in the 30s. What if we never found a museum? And so we have these things, but then later on we find things. There's a contradiction, not necessarily. Maybe we just didn't find the sign that gave us the true context to understand the other things we found. The archaeology can be wrong at times. And sometimes we catch it every so often. One year, my second dig site, the city of Lakeland, the first week we were there was a wall, an old city wall below us that had been dug like 70 years, 60 years before, and dated to the time of the kings. 1 week of digging, and we dated it back 1,000 years early. They just haven't found certain things. And for over half a century, this is from the time of the kings. We spent 1 week there, actually the time of Abraham. Sometimes things can change dramatically because we just haven't found enough to understand it yet. Still haven't. But there's a third possibility. And what is it? My first dig site, my third year there, someone discovered a manger made out of chalk. A manger, and there's a column. And then after a little clearing out more, we have a stable. And the archaeologists got really excited because this city is from King David's time. And the Bible mentions something in the story of one of David's wars. David defeated a Syrian king. And it says in 2 Samuel 8, that after David defeated Hadadezer, a king up in Syria, David hamstrung all the chariot horses from the bad guy's army. But he saved 100 chariots worth of horses. David destroys the chariot horse, and horses can't be used anymore, but he saves enough horses for 100 chariots. Why did David do that? David wants to start his own chariot horse. He's getting 100 chariots worth of horses, bringing them back so Israel can start experimenting and practicing and build up its own chariot horse. And then the next King Solomon, we read that he actually is in the chariot business and built bases for his chariots, starting with David right here. And so maybe this is one of David's early chariot bases. Wow! The beginning of David's chariot horse and his army that we read about to Solomon's time. And we found one of their bases. Exciting. Only after we dug a little more, a few days more, the stable was way too small for horses. In fact, it turned out with the dimensions, it was a good size for about 4 donkeys. See how easy it is to see a little bit and run we found this, we start interpreting it to this degree. There's a gap, what we have and what we conclude. And see, it's easy to get carried away sometimes and think we have more than we actually do. And we have to walk it back occasionally. This is not a chariot race. It's where God keeps his donkeys in the field. You see, that sort of thing happens sometimes. Sometimes we're wrong. We rush to judgments, we rush to conclusions, we misinterpret things. We either don't interpret the archaeology correctly, sometimes we don't interpret the Bible correctly. There's a problem for a long time digging Joshua's conquest. We dig all these cities up, but most of them were not destroyed. Well, wait a minute. The Bible says he conquered, destroyed all those places, but the cities, most cities weren't destroyed. There's no evidence of destruction. Is the Bible wrong? Look more carefully in the Bible. How many cities did Joshua actually destroy physically? 3. Jericho, Ai, and then the very last one, 7 years later, one in the north, a place called Hatzor or Hazor. Those are the only 3 that were destroyed in the Bible. But it's easy to assume he destroyed all the rest. Read the text, he didn't. We go digging there, there's not a contradiction. The Bible never said he destroyed all those cities. We shouldn't just assume we should find them destroyed in his time period. Sometimes we're wrong about the archaeology or about the Bible. As much as we think we understand it and try to, sometimes we make innocent mistakes and just assume something that doesn't actually say. So I believe 2 and 3 explain contradictions when they seem to show up. So what's its role? Archaeology can confirm things we read. It can reveal extra insights about Bible people or Bible events. Here's one example. Hezekiah, a good king of Judah, got rid of the idols, cut down the high places, and all this stuff, purged idolatry from Judah. One of my dig site where we dig at the wall, the city of Lachish, or Lachish, as they say there, in the gateway, our team found this little room right there. What is it? The tabernacle, we have a very good description. The tabernacle, we have an entrance that's blocked with a holy place, then we have the Holy of Holies, separated from the rest by a veil. The temple had the same design. A restricted entrance, the holy place, the Holy of Holies with an armed place. This little chamber in the entrance of the city is a small version of the tabernacle of the temple. It had a restricted entrance. You could only see through part of it. And you couldn't see all the way back because the doors didn't line up. There's a holy place, and then there's a most holy place with 2 altars back there. 2 altars side by side, maybe one for God and maybe one for Asherah, fertility goddess. This is from the time of Hezekiah, the king we just read about, who destroyed all these things. We found the temple had been destroyed. The altars that had their horns chopped off abruptly and damaged. And inside the Holy of Holies, you see the 2 altars there side by side. They were intentionally damaged. We found this. What's that look like? Don't be afraid. What's your first impression? What's it look like? A toilet. You're right. It's a toilet seat in the Holy of Holies. Why is there a toilet seat in the Holy of Holies? We found this in January of 2016. Why is there one there? It's a toilet. Well, the Bible gives some insight. There it is. There they are taking it out. But there's a story about 120, 130 years earlier up in the north, Jacob, when he got rid of Baal worship. It says he demolished the pillar of Baal and the house of Baal and made it a latrine. They turned it into a latrine, so the next guy couldn't just go and rebuild it in the same spot. You contaminate it, make it unholy, and you can't reuse it for the idol anymore. What do we have? Hezekiah did the same thing. He desecrated the temple, puts a toilet seat in the Holy of Holies. You can't use it as a high place to gain anymore. This is the first time we found that practice of making a latrine out of something. The first time we found it in archaeology. We found it at our team's site. So interesting detail, isn't it? Well, we'll conclude with this. Guidelines for Christians who want to use archaeology. First of all, don't believe everything we hear, even if it comes from other Christians or believers. Sometimes we're wrong, and sometimes they are too. Mind that gap, right? What do we actually have, and what do people sometimes get excited about and overinterpret? Don't try to use archaeology to prove the Bible. You can't prove that Jesus is the Son of God. You can't prove that Moses led the Israelites out of Egypt. Maybe you can find bits and pieces, but we can't watch these things happen. We can reveal the Bible, get better understanding, confirm things it talks about, confirm its historicity. But archaeology never proves anything. We always have the ultimate doubt. What if we're wrong? What if we haven't found something that changes what we think we know? Find the gap. What do we actually have, and what do people excitedly conclude sometimes? Be careful. Consider what the Bible actually says, and pay attention also to what it sometimes does not say that maybe we might not realize. And finally, be humble. That's a good policy for Christians anyway, but especially with archaeology. Well, I'll throw this up there if you want to write it down. I have a blog. I don't update it as much as I used to, but it has lots of photos, archaeological information on it. LukeChandler.wordpress.com. That's my lesson for tonight. But maybe something in here, maybe some of these small details has triggered something. I have doubts, or I'm not sure about my faith in the Bible, and yet we see details, even just a few weeks on tonight, trigger something. You know what? Why do I not have faith? Those things strengthen faith and give reasons to put faith in the Bible. And so I hope that whatever we do with archaeology, first and foremost, it can help lead us to Christ, lead others to Christ. It's a tool to lead people to God, put their trust in the Word of God. And if you need to respond in any way tonight, do so while we stand.